Hi there, everyone. We'll start in around 30 seconds, just getting the last people into the call. Great. I think we've got most of the people waiting onto the call. Good afternoon. Welcome to London Climate Action Week. My name's Nick Mabey. I'm CEO and co-founder of E3G, which is organising this event. And I'm going to moderate through the whole event, which is called Setting Sail for Timely Offshore Wind Delivery, Making the Most of the North Sea's Resources, which I think is a very pertinent and contemporary event for London Climate Action Week this year as we go into COP. We've got a great lineup of speakers, and I'm just going to go through the agenda. So we'll start. I'm going to give a very quick introduction to why we're holding this event and E3G's background in this area. Then we're going to get a video presentation from Eamon Ryan, the Irish Climate and Energy Minister, who unfortunately couldn't be with us live today, but as Eamon is perhaps the godfather of North Sea's grid, or one of the parents of the North Sea's grid process in Europe. We're really pleased he could come with us. Then we're going to have two panels. Firstly, focusing on the benefits of and the role of North Sea's grid matter in reaching overall net zero and climate targets in Europe and the UK. And then a second panel looking at actually how we do it. We will have questions and answers in each panel using the Q&A box, and we're also, I think participants are allowed to work in the chat, so you can keep your internal conversation moving as well. So without further ado, we will play, hopefully, technology allowing, Eamon Ryan's video to open up the event.
Hello, I'm very glad to join this London Climate Action Week event to discuss how we might share our North Sea's wind capacity. Eamon Ryan is my name. I'm Minister for the Environment, Climate Action, Communications and Transport in the Irish Government. I was former Minister of Energy from 2007 to 2011 and member of the European Council and the Irish Government. I should also say at the start, I suppose also for 5 years from 2011 to 2016, I was also an associate with E3G and did a lot of work on this subject for E3G, looking at this very question: how do we get cooperation to benefit from our offshore wind energy resources on these islands and on our continent, northwest part of it especially. I just want to share some personal experiences, some personal reflections, and I suppose an update of where we are as I see it from a political perspective in this whole project. My involvement goes back, I think it was 2004. There was a company called Electricity in Ireland. Eddie O'Connor was chief executive, and they partnered with General Electric for one of the first offshore wind farms, which went into the Irish Sea, 7 turbines, which were piled into a sandbank on the east coast of Ireland. I remember the excitement of that in the sense of, oh, this is the big new technology which is coming. I also remember at that time, I suppose some years after that, people started to think big in regard to what offshore wind could do. And often it was around concepts rather than necessarily immediate concrete engineering. I think Greenpeace in Netherlands had worked up a map, a concept as it were, on what they called a supergrid. And it was a very simple visual graphic, no more than that really, no huge figures or analysis or technological assessment behind it, but a concept of a grid which connected the various seas in the northwest of Europe and the offshore wind there to help power Europe. It was called a supergrid. At the same time, and there's a whole number of people who might claim credit rightly for the invention of this concept. The European Council was doing some really good progressive, in my mind, legislative and political work at the time. Andreas Pielboggs was the commissioner. And in that time, the idea of a North Seas offshore grid initiative was born. Seas was an important word because it included the Baltic and also, in my mind, the Irish Sea, including Bay of Biscay, the Atlantic. It was deliberately designed from the start to be regional, but to think big in terms of how we could connect the various waters in the northwest of Europe. There was 10 countries signed up, European Union countries with Norway, on that initiative. But in truth, that time, 2010, as people can remember, the financial crisis dominated everything. And for the subsequent 4 or 5 years, even after that, most big grand projects, particularly in the renewable energy area, tend to just were becalmed for a period. There was a fixation on the cost competitive advantage that fracked gas might have from the US. After the financial crash, it was difficult to get investment in big new infrastructure projects, and political attention to climate waned for a whole variety of different reasons, more than anything else, probably after the failure in Copenhagen to reach agreement. Things started to change around 2014, 2015, 2016, that sort of period, for a variety of reasons. Firstly, in fairness, the UK had shown real leadership and started to build out at scale some of the offshore wind farms that people prior to that had put down paper as pipe dreams. Climate came back on the agenda, French diplomacy, leading up to Paris and the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement. But more than anything else, a number of countries, including the UK, Denmark, Germany, others, started to design auction systems which brought the power of offshore wind dramatically down. Simple analysis in my mind was they de-risked what is a very significant upfront capital investment by taking out a lot of the planning or other risks at early stage of investment and development. And the response to that from large infrastructure developers was a real dramatic fall in the cost of installing offshore wind, which really woke everyone up to that this has real potential. It's taken some time since then, but we're starting to see some of the early ambition be realized. We're starting to see countries coming up with really ambitious ideas, which aren't just on paper, which I think will see fruition. The likes of offshore islands, where countries who don't have maybe big sea coast or whose waters are distant from where or wind power is distant from where the load is or the demand is, start to use measures such as that. New plans for interconnection and new plans for hybrid transmission connections to help reduce the cost of that transmission, but also to start to work collaboratively, as the North Seas Offshore Grid initiative set out for us to do at the very first time. A lot of the model of what we might do in this, it was founded in my mind in the original Nord Pool, which is where Scandinavian countries had come together much far earlier in the 70s and 80s, as I recall, and in a very forward-thinking manner, connected their grids and their systems to minimize or maximize rather the ability to shift and share power to bring down the costs in that way and give energy security. We need to do that now, in my mind, on a much wider area. There was political commitment towards that sort of approach grew in the mid-2015, 16, 17, and the European Commission supported it, and now I believe it's the very center of European energy policy. The recognition that offshore wind provides one of the alternatives when we can develop power at scale, hundreds of gigawatts of offshore wind, and in that way give us a secure supply, not dependent on imported fuels, benefiting from the engineering and grid skills that we have in abundance in Europe. Obviously, one of the problems in all this talk is that Brexit came too. From an Irish perspective, it's a real problem. We're on the island. We're an island on the far side of an island, disconnected from our European colleagues by our geographic location. And we're also inextricably linked with the UK in energy terms, not just north-south on our own island, but also east-west. Are dependent on gas transmission connections from the UK, our electricity connections with the UK, but also an understanding that as we move towards a higher and higher renewable integration, you can't balance that on isolated grids as an isolated energy island. You have to integrate. I think the UK knows that too. I think they're starting to realize that offshore wind is actually one of their main ways of meeting this low carbon new energy future we need. And that even for the UK, size of the market of the UK, going it alone, trying to balance that power on an isolated UK grid is not going to work. And the UK does not have a lot of interconnection with its continental cousins. Even before Brexit, there was a shortage for a whole variety of different historic reasons. One of the things we have to do now, whatever happens with the protocol and with Brexit and the trade agreements as they roll out, is that we have to make sure that we maintain energy integration of the UK in whatever way is possible within the framework agreement which has been reached, so that we don't lose the huge benefit that comes from meshed integrated grids. As renewable powers have a stronger and stronger role, that meshing of power system, grids, offshore wind delivers huge benefits. I recall working with my colleagues in E3G, working with the modelling people in Imperial College in London, the very best, and the analysis was so clear that that integrated meshed approach to how you develop offshore grids and develop offshore wind delivers savings in the tens of billions. I think they've done some further upgraded analysis recently, which doubles down on that. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have is to make sure that we maintain that interconnection regardless of Brexit as best we can. In Ireland, we were one of the first out of the traps with those 7 turbines in the Irish Sea back in 2004. We focused on onshore wind in the interim, correctly in my mind, because it was much cheaper and we have to get competitive power. We need to run our other industries in an efficient, competitive manner. We've been very good at integrating onshore wind into an isolated grid, but now we realize that the next step for us is going offshore. We're going to build about 5 gigawatts in the Irish Sea, and then we're going to move south, or at the same time, we'll start moving into the Celtic Sea to the south and to the west. ESB, one of our large electricity companies, has teamed up with Equinor, the Norwegian former Statoil company, with an aim for 1.5 gigawatts to the west of the Shannon Estuary. And that's just one of many large developments which are now starting to look and see this possibility. Our programme for government is committed to some 35 gigawatts of offshore wind. And because our sea area is 10 times our land area, and because our sea area is probably one of the windiest places on the planet, it is a real potential economic development opportunity for us. It's also happening, it's not just happening in Europe, it's not just happening in Ireland, it's in the US now and in Japan and China and in other locations. And I think it's that scale of development that's going to occur, in my mind, particularly with evolving new technological innovation around floating wind and around the use of electrolyzers and hydrogen as the wind power comes ashore, that is going to see this whole initiative, this whole sector grow and become a significant part of our energy future, our zero carbon energy future that we have to deliver now in the next 2 decades. One of the key things, come back to what I was saying earlier on, is getting the financing right. And it's de-risking it, as I said earlier on. That trick that was learned in those auctions in the middle part of the last decade is what we're going to have to repeat. We're going to have to make sure that the planning system is done rightly, that the interconnection with other uses of our North Seas, be that fishing, there's defence and all sorts of cabling, telecommunications, a whole range of other interests. We have to integrate this in a way that gets the planning right. And that in turn eases the financing uncertainty, which helps bring the cost down. And I think also, lastly, a last point I'd make, what we're increasingly learning is industrial development will come with the development of this sector. The initial analysis, because we're only at the start of this new hydrogen revolution as well as an offshore wind energy revolution, is that using the energy close to the point it's generated, close to the point it comes ashore in the case of offshore wind, is going to be optimal. So I'm looking at development of our offshore wind resource as actually an industrial development opportunity at the deep water ports where we would bring it ashore. I think it's probably something very similar in the UK. UK has a proud history in the Clyde and in the Tyne and in the Humber and in the Thames and in all those river industrial ports that Britain has had of developing industry opportunities. And that's why I think the UK government has continued to go strong and so clearly on this. And they're not alone. My German, Belgian, Dutch, Spanish, French, and other colleagues, Danes, Norwegians are all thinking and seeing the same. This is one of those dreams that's actually turning into reality. We have to be careful, we have to scale it up in a proper planned way, we have to maintain public confidence in what we're doing. But I don't think there's any going back. I think the North Seas and cooperation in the North Seas is going to be one of the defining economic developments of our time. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That was great intervention from Eamon there, even though he couldn't be with us in person. And it's particularly good to have his perspective on the historical context of this and really showing how long the ideas and Eamon's involvement in the ideas of a more integrated planned development for North Seas grids have been in play, which in one way is good that we're working on ideas, but also is a warning that just because we're talking about things doesn't mean they happen in practice. And just to give a bit of perspective on that from E3G's point of view, we've been working on the idea of a North Seas grid since 2007-8. As Eamon said, he was very key in our discussions and work. And we really saw it as a critical path for rapid decarbonisation. But again, looking back at the work we did then, it's very clear that the role of offshore wind and the aspirations people have for the scale and pace of change have massively increased since our first work. We recently, as Eamon also mentioned, updated our research working with Imperial College to do some modelling about the implications of the plans that UK, Ireland, Europe have for offshore wind and what that means for working together and grid interconnection, looking at a scale of nearer to 100 gigawatts additional in the North Sea by 2030 and potentially up to 500, 600 gigawatts in 2050, which is an unimaginable scale compared to, I remember working on the Green Investment Bank in the UK and getting some of the first deals off for the first offshore wind farms in the UK when we're talking about a few gigawatts. So our aspirations have changed, but the impact and that change in aspiration means it's even more important when you look at the practicalities and the costs of coordinating and having an interconnected build out. We did in this research, we looked at the difference between an uncoordinated and a coordinated cross-national grid in the North Seas, and the savings go from 25 to up to 50 billion euros to 2050 in terms of raw cost savings. But also, perhaps even more important in some ways, and that's a lot of money, is that by reducing the number of cables, because that cost saving comes from laying less cables in less places, we actually end up with less environmental disturbance and potentially less resistance from populations for bringing power onshore in different places. So it both lowers the cost to consumers, which is good, and to industry, but also hopefully makes the planning and logistical exercises also easier. And as climate change is a race against time, we've got anything that makes it easier and faster to do things is a massive benefit. I think the other piece of the scenarios we looked at, which is interesting, is how offshore wind is a critical scale-up technology, quickly scalable technology, to be honest, because it's offshore, to deal with other uncertainties, whether that's in electricity demand for heating and cooling or mobility, looking at other balancing solutions such as green hydrogen and the use of green hydrogen in industry, which also massively affects electricity demand in different scenarios. On the other side, if we see less progress in smart grids and in demand side response, we will need more grid interconnection to balance power flows. And if we have less than anticipated rollout than CCS, another technology E3G's worked on for years, which is the pattern to date, then again, we will need to have higher electricity demand. So Also, having a scalable, efficient, integrated grid gives us a huge risk management tool to use on other parts of the completely interconnected climate transition. When you look at the scenarios we've done recently, though, we saw clearly that an awful lot of the benefits for Europe and the UK come from working together. There are far few benefits if that part of the interconnection, if Europe just interconnects with Europe, if UK just interconnects and optimizes on its own. So that raises some of the issues that Eamon talks about, which is, firstly, how do we coordinate inside the EU to have benefits? That's not as simple as people think. We've worked on European integration for years, but also how do we work between the UK and all the European countries involved and Europe as a whole to get those integrated benefits? And again, this is one of the things we always started on the North Sea's grid. We saw it as a first part of a discussion about the overall European supergrid, again, something which Eamon mentioned, because there are renewable resources in other parts of the European periphery, to the east in the Western Balkans and hydro, but also into Ukraine and other areas, huge amounts of cheap onshore wind power, and to the south, solar in North Africa. Flows can go either way there. So this model of connecting with third countries on the periphery of Europe, working across Europe and managing that as a single European grid is not just a North Seas agenda, it's also a southern and eastern agenda, which is critical if we're actually going to get anywhere near net zero by 2050 in practice. So that's the context. That's why we thought it would be a useful discussion, a timely discussion to have at this point in the year. And I'd like to then open to the first panel, which is really going to go over some of these issues of why it makes a difference and what role the North Seas grid could make in delivering our climate targets. And I'm particularly interested in hearing where we need to be in the short term. So what would be kind of success in 2030, given the aspirations people have? Because it's great talking about 2050, but as even COP26 shows, it's all about the short term and getting that halfway there by 2030. So we've got a panel and they'll each give a 5-minute intervention and then we'll take some questions. So firstly, we have Dan Monzani from BEIS, Director at BEIS, then Martin Finucane from DECC in Ireland, and then last but not least, Morten Petersen, the MEP and Rapporteur on offshore wind for Renew from the European Parliament. So first I'm going to turn to Dan, if you can give me your first 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. And reassuringly, I hope a lot of what I'm going to say is going to echo the last two, the video and what you just had to say. So a couple of things from a UK perspective. I mean, absolutely right that offshore wind is critical to our plans to decarbonise, and having both committed to net zero by 2050 and to the 6th carbon budget, which requires very steep decarbonisation, 78% on 1990 terms by the mid-2030s. A big part of that is electrification, and a huge part of electrification is offshore wind. That's why we put it centrally in our energy white paper before Christmas, and the Prime Minister had it front and centre in his 10-point plan. In terms of some of the numbers, I'm sure they're very familiar to a lot of people who follow the UK debate, but we aim to have 40 gigawatts of offshore wind connected and operational by 2030, and including amongst that a gigawatt of floating. But it doesn't stop there and it keeps going. So I think it's really clear we need lots of offshore wind. And to do that, there's obviously an incredibly strong case for more coordinated development to start with, just amongst how we build out that offshore wind. And we agree with you, Nick, about the cost benefits of just making sure you've thought through the most efficient way of cabling up. But also actually there's some speed of delivery benefits potentially, so that connections aren't the constraint on actually putting those wind up as we get into that sort of exponential growth. And finally, possibly most importantly, actually, there's an important part of bringing people with us, particularly in some of the most affected areas. And in the short run, East Anglia is where a lot of our wind is being connected, but in the future, the Irish Sea, Northern Scotland and so forth, will see a similar growth. And we think we can reduce some, though of course not all, the onshore impacts by building out in a more coordinated way. And that's got to be the right thing to do in and of itself for the people who live there, but also in terms of the planning process and the speed of delivery, it helps to bring people with us. Now, finally, of course, I've talked largely about coordination there within our own terms, but we see international cooperation as a really important part of doing this properly. And essentially that's partly because we're all trying to solve very similar problems, and therefore sharing best practices and grid planning, joint projects, different regulatory and market arrangements is common sense. But also it gives us the opportunity to look at things like hybrid projects or multi-purpose interconnectors that allow us to both increase the degree to which we're interconnected with other countries around the North Seas, and also to connect up wind both in our waters and theirs. And that's an important part of the offshore transmission network review, which we launched with the Energy White Paper and we're doing over the course of this year, looking at both the short-term opportunities to improve coordination and the longer term, and indeed the multi-purpose interconnectors with other countries. We've also made it central to the agreements we've entered into. So most obviously in the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU, where there's North Seas cooperation clause, including a number of the aspects I've just talked about. But we announced even this week that we're close to a deal with Norway on our cooperation with them and on interconnection, which this plays into. So I don't think I've said anything that doesn't just underscore the reasons you very eloquently set out actually for a more coordinated approach to offshore wind and working very closely both here and increasingly through COP26 globally on how green grids can help us to get there.
And as you've been very good on time, one thing, so in terms of if what keeps you awake at night in terms of what might get in the way of this wonderful vision? What's the is it public opinion on onshore? Is it our inability to actually deliver some of the technology? What are some of the big things in your mind which we have to crack if we're going to make this vision a reality?
So I think time is the thing that we're working against, isn't it? The ambitions are so high, and in relatively short times, if you start from scratch and plan out the networks and the wind farm that you need to put in place, it probably takes you 10 years. And yet we're trying to do such a massive decarbonisation for which we have 14 years remaining. So clearly we're going to have to do a mixture of things that work with in-flight projects and look at the existing plans, as well as looking longer term and more ambitiously about what we could do if we started with a blank sheet of paper. So I think time's the real challenge here, but that's why we're trying to attack it from all different angles.
Brilliant, thanks so much for that. Martin, how does it look like from Ireland, and what's top of your list for getting the most benefits, and what benefits mean most to you?
Thanks, Nick. I think kind of the previous speakers, Minister Ryan, yourself and Dan, have kind of gone through the majority of benefits, and I don't think any of us or most of us would disagree with any of those. I think the biggest change that I would have seen in this particular field in recent years is actually the whole concept of total decarbonisation. So that we're no longer arguing about aiming for specific targets. It's not getting 10% of this or 30% of that. The aim is total decarbonisation by 2050 of the economy, but in particular the realisation that we need to decarbonise electricity in order to underpin that in a far quicker fashion. So really it's about how we do that and when we can do it, not if we do it. So the days of talking about targets, I think, are kind of, they're useful checkpoints, but you know, they're no longer limits. There is no limit to this, it's total. I think kind of the benefits, I think, of offshore wind, I think have been spoken about and mentioned, and rather than risk repeating the same ones, I think kind of all you have to do is look at how the market itself is developing. The early stages, you know, the last 10, 15 years, we've seen offshore wind farms develop primarily on a wind farm by wind farm basis. And what we've seen is planning at an individual project level, be that either the project itself, in terms of the marine spatial planning aspects of it, in terms of the cabling and grid connection aspect of it, and in terms of the market support for it. And I think as we look at how the sector is changing, and changing very, very rapidly, we're getting much bigger turbines, much more efficient turbines. That's leading to much bigger project sizes. You know, instead of talking now about a couple of 100 megawatts, you're now talking average sizes of a gigawatt plus scale. We're going in much, much further from shore. We're going into deeper waters. And it's now getting to the stage where not only are you doing that, but you're attracting far higher capacity factors as a result of doing that. So the combination of all of those factors coming together in the market at one time is pointing very clearly to one thing from our perspective: that traditional way of doing business will not work and will not work well. We need to reform completely how we're approaching the concept of moving to scale at this level. And in reality, that can only be done through cooperation. I think as Minister Ryan outlined it at the start, by all players around the Northern Seas. So that's European Union members, but also other non-EU members that we share those various seas with. I think that we all have an important role to play in this. And it will certainly work better if we cooperate together than try and do our own thing. I think if we're to gain the benefits of the economies of scale right across all those different subsectors, we need really to work together at an early stage to derive the benefits from that. Because left to its own devices, I don't think the market is really capable of doing that. Markets work on a profit basis, a just-in-time basis, and on what's good for my company basis, not what's good for a societal return. And that's what we have to do, I think, at political and administrative level, is make sure that a lot of those societal benefits are achieved, as opposed to just maximizing profit on any individual project. Nothing wrong with profits. Without profits, projects wouldn't get built. But it's a question of balancing the whole spectrum of events that need to do it. I think in terms of, I mean, for years, while the UK was a member of the European Union, it took an active and I'd say leading role in an awful lot of the debate at the North Seas offshore cooperation and the different aspects that it's taken since its foundation well over a decade ago now. And definitely I think through exploring the different working groups that were there in terms of grid, looking at hybrid projects, market arrangements, regulatory support schemes. It's very clear, I think, to all who are sitting around the table that the benefits of mutual cooperation were there. And I think it's unfortunate that the events, I think around Brexit and some of the negotiations around that have delayed some of that cooperation. But I do think it's very important that we work together in a positive way to bring that level of cooperation as close as we can back to where it should be and traditionally has been. And to do so in a way that is foreseen under the auspices of the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And it is specifically referenced within that context. So, it is envisaged that we will get back to a much closer working relationship. I liked Dan's answer to the question at the very end. What's the one single thing that's important on this and is most challenging? And the answer being time. He's very right in what he's saying. But it's not just the time in terms of delivering the development times for projects and for the supporting infrastructure to actually come into place. One of the other things we're doing, and certainly I know from an Irish level where we're very much still developing the early concrete steps to develop the projects, the foundation stones basically, is really that there's an awful lot of coordination required across a lot of complicated work streams that all have to land in the right place at the right time for us to achieve the benefits of the economies of scale. And I think the You refer to it yourself, Nick, in terms of the environmental perspective, and public acceptance is a key part of this. Infrastructure at scale, we're all challenged, I think, socially in a lot of cases by getting it developed. And if we can coordinate and reduce quite significantly in a lot of cases the amount of infrastructure that's required, onshore as well as offshore, because it's not just the projects and landing the cables onshore. It's also then been able to move the very large amounts of power that will ultimately be generated. I mean, we talk about the targets or aims for 2030. At EU level, we're looking at 60 gigawatts for 2030 and around 300 gigawatts by 2050. But that's electricity that needs to go to onshore markets that are well beyond our coastal regions. So we need to look at how we can gear up the onshore grid to accept that quantum of power coming off the offshore power and bringing it to the centers of demand right across the continent. And I think that's one of the key challenges that's there. It's not just offshore, it's also the onshore piece. So I think kind of working together to develop these is going to be the critical part. And I think kind of the EU will be sitting down, I know, with the UK administration shortly to work out the terms of a memorandum of understanding to enable that work to come back into place at EU level on the North Seas. And I very much look forward to working cooperatively on that with Dan and everyone else around the table. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks very much. And I think it's good news to hear that they're kind of as an MOU in the offing. I suppose from what I take from what you said, there's enough to do in reform and changing our outlook and our philosophy of how we do planning inside in countries without having to have kind of unnecessary disputes across borders, because this is such a big reform agenda. It's not just business as usual joined up. It's a very different business as usual. I think that's quite an important one to in terms of the time. Morten, where does it look from you? How can the European Parliament put some, make sure that these arguments don't stop us getting the benefits which consumers want, which, and again, just to come back, we have been talking about this for 10 years and it wasn't just Brexit that slowed things down. In our view, there were many other structural problems getting in the way, which we need to deal with on both sides of the channel.
Absolutely, and this is so easy to say and so difficult to do in practice, and this is what we'll be struggling with over the years to come. First of all, thanks for having me, and I can echo a lot of what has been said already, given the tremendous potential and opportunities in the offshore sector in general. And if I may just take a step back, the IEA report coming out a couple of weeks ago emphasized that there is a path to net zero in 2050, but this path is narrowing and narrowing for every day passing. So I think it's extremely important to inject a true sense of urgency in terms of what's on the table in terms of legislation, and European Parliament will soon be working intensively with the Green Deal. We're revising the TenneT regulation right now, which where offshore also is extremely relevant, obviously, and the entire discussion on electrifying the entire economies and societies all over Europe is increasingly taking pace and gaining momentum, which it should. So my overall point is that we should be extremely busy, that there is a real sense of urgency when it comes to developing offshore further that one do. And I think simply put that we can say simply that what has got us where we are today will not bring us where we want to be by 2030 or even 2050. I mean, we have to accelerate pace. We have to change gears in all this. And to me, it seems that we have at least three broad categories of issues on the table. Infrastructure was mentioned already, for sure. Looking at the staggering amount of euros or pounds or what have you Danish kroner for that matter, that we need to invest in grids is just mind blowing. And in order to integrate further renewables and offshore into our grids is obviously a very, very big challenge. Secondly, from the European Union side, we need to look at our market design. We have to revisit the market design rules. We have to discuss further congestion income and the balance between TSOs and developers in order to ensure that we get the incentives right. Because if we want to build out from the European side with at least 60 gigawatt by 2030, then we have to change tech and do it differently. And then the third category, which is just so difficult, is obviously the permitting issues. And we have so many different processes going on within the European Union on maritime spatial planning issues, as well as taking into account all the multiple interests at sea, biodiversity, fisheries, the navies out there, commercial, merchant, sailing routes, etc., etc. And getting this right in order to basically speed up. I mean, we have to look at the entire permitting domain, and we have to have a new approach to this, because my worry is, and this is what keeps me awake at night, is that if we do not get this right, we will not succeed, and we have to succeed given the magnitude of the climate change and the Paris Agreement and our climate objectives. So, all this to say that I see that if we are to increase collaboration, which essentially also was the point from the IEA report, that if we are to succeed in combating climate change, we need to increase collaboration within the EU, as well as with the Brits, even after Brexit, given all the difficulties that this gives for all of us. So I think that there is a sense of urgency. We have to increase collaboration. We have to solve this permitting riddle, and if not, we simply will not succeed. So this is my big worry looking over the next couple of years. How do we address this? How do we approach this in order to get this right? So let me finish here, and I'm looking so much forward to the discussion. One final thought, though. Even though this is at least the experience from my experience from European Parliament, that the offshore discussions are very easily seen in a purely North Sea context, which is not the entire context. I mean, we have the Baltics, we have the Mediterranean, we have the Black Sea, and we have, and which also has to be taken in account, tremendous industrial perspectives in terms of exports of systems to Asia or the US or wherever relevant. But it is not a given in a European context, this offshore issue. I mean, it sounds so obvious to not least all the nations having a shoreline with to the North Sea, but you have other countries out there where focus might be different. So one of the main tasks that I have is to ensure that you have a political buy-in from all over Europe into this offshore issue, making offshore and basically making electricity relevant in the future, power to X or production of hydrogen or heat pumps or electrification of transports, etc., etc. It is not a given. This is also something that we have to work hard on. Thank you so much. I look forward to the discussion.
Great. We have a good audience, but a very shy audience in terms of questions and answers. So please put some more questions in the chat. However, I came fully armed with questions. I'm going to go back to Dan and Martin, really picking up on this, which is, have we got the balance between the traditional focus on efficiency and in many ways capital efficiency and pace? And do we need to, and again, on this partly because I think if we're going to cooperate, we have to think about the problem in the same way, because you can't, it's kind of quite a deep level. So what's the thinking? I think Martin talked about it most strongly, so I'll kind of turn to Dan first about who's talking about actually market reform. In the end, pace needs to win over 1 percentage points cheaper if you're going to do climate. How do we actually do that? So what are some of the thinking you're going through in trying to balance these different philosophies, and particularly in the regulators who are in the end the ones who give permission for many of these things and are independent, but being reassessed in the UK, at least at the moment? Dan.
Yeah, okay, good set of questions there. So first of all, it's not always the case that there's a pace cost trade-off. And one of the things I think is happening in the North Sea is it's the dynamic of the market that's shifted. So we set up the offshore grid as a separate regime so that we can introduce competition into the construction of networks. Now that is both good for deepening your pool of capital, getting people who are offering a better service in terms of the speed of which it's delivered, and driving down costs. And it makes most sense when, of course, there's multiple sites in a region where you want to actually find out the one that's got the best combination of developers, network developers, and physical properties. It's not obvious it makes as much sense in the way it's set up at the moment when you've got to build out the whole area, and therefore coordination has a stronger emphasis, and the level at which you introduce competition just needs to change in terms of its planning. So it's not necessarily a trade-off between cost and delivery. It's just that the model's shifted because of the sheer scale of build out there. I think, though, you're also hinting at the degree to which particularly regulators ought to lean into anticipatory investment. And there's some truth in that, both offshore and onshore, actually, because we could, frankly, at the moment, build as much offshore wind in Scotland as we like, but it gets stuck behind a constraint, and we need to reinforce. We need to do two things. Firstly, to reinforce the ability to get power south, but also invest in making sure the system is as flexible as possible, so it makes use of existing capacity to the greatest possible extent. And yeah, I think you've seen probably in the transmission price controls in this country that Ofgem's lent in quite a lot in terms of net zero investment, where it said there's a sort of automatic trigger where things are happening that will allow people to get on and build those networks. And it's certainly something that I think they recognise, that acting in the best interests of consumers, which is their duty, absolutely includes getting ready for net zero and making sure that the time criticality of that is taken into account, whilst of course not forgetting entirely the traditional value for money side of being a regulator, nor indeed the energy security side of that. So I think there's a shift, actually, and people recognise that this is a massive step up. We've also said we will make sure that's absolutely clear in our strategy and policy statement, which is our way of giving voice to our joint strategy between the department and the regulator. We'll consult on that later in the year.
Right, and Martin, I think there's also a related question, but it's kind of, perhaps a better way is cooperation versus competition as the kind of underlying philosophy. At what level on, is there is competition law basically getting in the way of strategic coordination around building out? Do we need to do that, or can it be handled under environmental exceptions? How do you see those balances? Do you think there needs to be some fundamental rule changes in European rules to accommodate what we need, or can we kind of use some patches in the short term? Again, no one wants to do treaty change or fundamental change of rules if they can avoid it, if you're trying to go fast, but sometimes you have to. So Martin, interested in your view of the same question as Dan, but also the question we've had through on competition law.
I think in ways, if you look at it from the political and administrative level, what we're actually trying to do is not nationalize or take over planning and building and designing. That is something that is probably best approached by the open market, and the companies are very innovative and creative in dealing with this. But what we are trying to do is do it at kind of the higher level to ensure that the market frameworks knit together. And it's really so that we don't see markets competing with market frameworks. What we actually see are companies able to compete on a fair basis as possible across markets and within markets. I think that's the key to it. But the higher level, kind of a lot of that centralized planning or coordinated approaches aren't particularly at kind of a competitive level. They're at kind of the supporting infrastructure, or supporting policy or regulatory approaches, and then let the competitive edge come in for the actual projects themselves, or to build the actual infrastructure.
Brilliant. And Morten, I'd like to come to this kind of last question, given running out of time, and the others may want to comment on it. You mentioned, I mean, this is back to the public permission, and there's, in a sense, it's who needs to be involved when to build that permission. As you say, you were talking about marine uses was pretty critical there. You could also say, I mean, there's a question in the chat about the relationship to hydrogen, you know, making the value case for this more clearly. At the moment, this is a very technical kind of industrial complex debate. People don't, it's not something people talk about down the pub after the football's being worked through. So what, and especially as you're, you know, as a parliamentarian, what do we need to do as we track forward all these reforms and great technical visions to build the social contract around this project, which is as a project, even if it's multiple places, to make sure that we don't hit a social or political roadblock, even if we've kind of got rid of some of the administrative and technical roadblocks?
Well, if only I knew, Nick, if only I was able to to pinpoint this. My worry is, again, coming back to the sense of urgency and the speed needed in order to fulfill our targets. And this NIMBYism we see in all over Europe. We see it onshore, we see it offshore, and to the extent of the maritime special planning issues and the real dilemmas inherent in this. And I foresee that this sort of clash of interest, this conflict of interests on the NIMBYism agenda is going to be perhaps one of the toughest cases for all of us over the next 10, 20 years, given what is needed in terms of rolling out new infrastructure and given what is needed in terms of deploying offshore facilities. And I can only say that we have not gotten this right so far. For sure. In European Parliament, we're discussing right now the TenneT regulation, and you have initiatives like one-stop shops per seed basin in order to ensure that developers at least can only need to address one public authority on this. We have cases in my country, Denmark, that terrible cases for developers that do not know what is going on inside the administration, or you have different administrations doing different things. So, I mean, there are some low-hanging fruits on this, ensuring that the maritime spatial planning processes are coordinated with what member states are submitting in terms of their national energy and climate plans as a bare minimum. And you can introduce one-stop shops, but underneath all this, you have the real conflicts, the real dilemmas that we eventually have to resolve. And this is going to be a political issue at the end of the day, how to balance the interests in terms of combating climate change, not in opposition, but a real dilemma with the biodiversity or maritime spatial planning issues out there. I think my basic conclusion in this is, given that the sense of urgency we have with climate change, I mean, we have to change approach to this and roll out more speedily that we've managed to do so far. Very, very long and try to answer your great question, Nick.
Brilliant. We're out of time, but that was a great conversation. Lots of things. I think the point of pace, timing, really came through strongly, and the need for really fundamental reforms. I think the philosophy of competition versus cooperation, I know a lot of other think tanks who will think differently than we do. So I think that's quite an important conversation to get right before we try and turn things into law. I quite like the idea, which I got, that actually the one thing that might bring all of these politicians together is the fear of having to deal with their own public. So anything that makes dealing with their publics, they're more afraid of their public on NIMBYism. So that's the way we encourage international cooperation, is by selling it as a way of reducing domestic political tensions on planning and infrastructure. I think that probably is more resonant than some billions in the future for a politician. So perhaps we should make sure that conversation is higher. And I used to work on fisheries policy in the UK government, and one of my previous sins I did or something bad in the past life, I had to think bringing marine and fisheries together with offshore wind would make it easier to solve. But part of me thinks perhaps it's one of those times where making a problem bigger makes it more solvable. That's one we should take away, because we do need to resolve that in a more structured way, rather, as you say, rather than the piecemeal way. So I think that was brilliant. I think there's lots of things which could change the debate and move things forward faster. we're now going to switch to the next panel. So thanks very much, Dan, Martin, Morten. It's been brilliant. Thanks so much for your time. I hope you can stay and listen as well. And then we'll move seamlessly to our next panel, which in a way, then it's one of the reasons I teed up the last question, was a move from talking about the benefits and perhaps the risks of this transition and the potential for a North Sea's grid to the how, and particularly the role of stakeholders. So the aim of this is to actually, how do we tackle that integration of the North Sea's grid in a very practical way? And we've got three great speakers who are kind of in the middle of trying to do the doing as opposed to agreeing the agreeing from the policy level. So Nicola Medalova, who's the Managing Director for Interconnectors at National Grid, and Mette, Lysbech, the Head of Market Development and Wind Farm Design in Vattenfall, and Jan-Paul Dijckmans, who's Director for Strategy and Partnership at TenneT. Again, 5 minutes, please. Then we'll move to some Q&A. You know, you've heard what other people have to say, so you can move on from there. Tell them what they need to do to deliver this. And Nicola, you're first.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here today. So we've heard a lot already about the enormous opportunities that as Europeans we have to exploit the natural resources on our doorstep from the North Sea, but the clock is ticking. I'm responsible for National Grid's interconnector business, which operates separately from National Grid's core regulated businesses. And as far back as 1986, we've been working closely with our European partners to build and operate these amazing interconnector assets. And so I think it's worth remembering that what we might call the first phase of offshore development is already well underway, with the deployment of offshore wind and point-to-point interconnectors. And I think that's a fantastic platform to build from. We're currently in the middle of a £2 billion investment programme that will bring the UK to almost 8 gigawatts of interconnection with mainland Europe in 2 years' time. And these assets are playing a vital role already in optimising renewables, decarbonising the energy system and ensuring a flexible and reliable source of power. But as I mentioned, they've also allowed us to develop really strong and productive relationships with our partner TSOs around North West Europe. Partnerships that's going to become even more crucial as we look to the next phase of development. For the last 18 months, we've been speaking to everyone and anyone that we can about multi-purpose or hybrid interconnectors, because they come with the enormous benefits that we've talked about today: better coordination of projects, corridors, technologies, and importantly, landing sites in coastal communities that helps with planning. But specifically to Nick's question earlier of what we can achieve by 2030, at National Grid, we've got 6.4 gigawatts of grid connection agreements that we could use to develop multi-purpose hybrid interconnectors to access neighbouring markets by 2030. We've got the technology. National Grid is used to procuring, building and operating HVDC technology of the type and scale that we need. We just need to take it one step further. We're already working with partners such as TenneT and Elia to develop real projects. And it's our aim to have a Pathfinder project defined by the end of this year, with a view to delivering at least one operational multi-purpose hybrid interconnector by 2029. In the UK, we need dozens and dozens of landfalls to deliver 40 gigawatts by 2030. And as we've heard already, reducing the amount of cable landfalls and DC converter stations is something we would all want to achieve to make offshore wind and interconnection more palatable to local communities and stakeholders. And so I guess the question is, why wouldn't we do more of this, or more quicker at least? And I think there's a couple of really important questions that we have to answer, and they centre around the regulatory and commercial frameworks that would apply to multi-purpose hybrid interconnectors and the cost to consumers. For example, the 70% rule, where 70% of capacity must be available for interconnection, that's already hindering the development of hybrid interconnectors. We need a better, more integrated way to deliver offshore projects, and that's what brings us here today, which is fantastic. The key challenge and the beauty with the development of the North Sea grid is that no one country, system operator or market participant can do it themselves. We all need to work together outside of business as usual, and if I may say, outside the usual politics, to develop a coordinated framework for the development of multi-purpose hybrid interconnectors. And I think we've got the right platforms to make this happen. In the UK, I think the work that BEIS are doing on the offshore transmission network review is fabulous. And I do believe that we can do even more over the next few months to get all the market players together to collaborate on a framework that works for wind and transmission developers and works for consumers and local communities. At the EU level, as we enter a new chapter after Brexit, we have similar targets, both in terms of offshore wind and decarbonisation. The energy chapter in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement ensures that we'll continue to cooperate in the way that we have done with our partners all throughout. And at a global level, as we look forward to COP26, I believe that the UK and Europe can set a real example to the world on how to efficiently connect offshore wind while mitigating the impact on coastal communities. But at the end, it still comes down to us. And as we've heard from Dan Monzani earlier, we've got a big time challenge. We can't spend years trying to come up with the perfect regime. We need to follow the principle of learning by doing through the delivery of Pathfinder projects. And I think we've got the vision, I think we've got the technology, and I think we've got the political will. I think now what we need is the answer to some of the big questions that we have around the commercial and regulatory framework and the platform to start some of these Pathfinder projects that will really help us to deliver some great examples of hybrid interconnectors by 2030 and a fantastic platform for building on thereafter.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I'll move straight to Mette.
Thank you. Well, I can echo what you just said, Nicola, but thank you for giving us a voice in this forum. We have in Vattenfall been part of the offshore development for many years, and we have seen the need for what key elements do we have to have in place to have this on track, on time. So to mention a few of them, we need to have a focus on the streamlined planning process that will balance the needs of multiple stakeholders. We need an integrated and flexible grid where offshore and onshore elements are planned in harmony. We need a stable regulatory framework to underpin and continue to attract the billions of pounds or euros of private sector capital. And then this all needs to come together in a healthy balance of risk and reward for everyone involved. I think that in addition to the key elements just mentioned, we will see that some geographies will require grid reforms to be able to deliver the offshore ambitions that we have. And like mentioned earlier, I would also like to welcome the work that BEIS and Ofgem has done on delivering the offshore transmission network review. That is, we need more of that. And I think also in the longer term and in certain locations, a more integrated offshore grid with shared infrastructures between wind farms, interconnectors and offshore demand could well reduce the cost to consumer and the local impact of the development. As you have also mentioned earlier, Nick, and it's in your report, but we fully agree to that assessment. Delivering the reforms that's needed to take us to the even 2030, 2050 is going to take time. We have seen that regardless of how many people will come together and try and solve this together, it will take time. And we don't have time. We have an emergency knocking on our door and it's calling for action now. We need to solve the issues around the climate. It's therefore paramount and key that the offshore wind continues to be able to deliver on its current path and on its current timescale. Therefore, the existing connection agreements needs to be honored. We need to enable the opportunities that we have right in front of us to be ready to go. We have in Vattenfall built a wind farm that connected two markets, our Danish Kriegers Flak wind farm. That was not easy. We have, it's basically only worked due to an exemption from the EU. And as we all know, exemptions is not a sustainable way forward for build out of offshore wind. The early stage MPIs can be delivered pre-2030. but also they will need to have the right policies and regulation in place to allow them to happen. It's not just going to happen on its own. The benefits are huge. These projects can reduce the associated onshore and offshore infrastructure, and thereby we can provide a more coordinated and efficient solution for the wind farms and the interconnectors. In solving these issues, the hosting countries needs to be involved and drive the integral solutions to getting the MPIs off the ground and over the finish line. And we have talked about time several times here today, and time is of the essence. To deliver timely, we need the policymakers not only to, I would say, not only to set sail, as we have in the title of the session here, but also to hoist the spinnaker and together clarify the applications of rules and determine the regulatory way forward. The governments, the regulators, the developers like ourselves, we must work together to enable these Pathfinder projects. We cannot sit and wait. And I think that was my message next.
That's two Pathfinder projects, which I think we're going to come back to as a way of unblocking both cooperation inside and reform inside Europe and between the UK and Europe. Jan Paul, interested in your practical, because I think one of the things here is we're all in violent agreement about the benefits and violent agreement that there's no time. That obviously that's something missing in the middle, which is, okay, how do those two things get reconciled? Jan Paul.
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for inviting me to this event. My name is Jan Paul Dijckmans, and I'm responsible for strategy and partnerships in TenneT. That includes business development and also interconnector development. TenneT has been proactively exploring and developing interconnections with our neighboring countries, obviously AC connections with Belgium and Germany, but we have also developed DC links between the Netherlands and Norway, the UK, and recently Denmark. And also with National Grid, we have a long-standing working relationship with the BritNed interconnector. We will be connecting up to 30 gigawatts of offshore wind in 2030. That's in Germany and in the Netherlands together. And we expect that the politics might even increase these levels in the near future. And we are trying to set new standards also with regard to technology, where we are exploring to move to a 2 gigawatt standard that we will also develop multi-purpose interconnector ready. And as a matter of fact, the German government also, the Dutch government also allows us to make the required necessary anticipatory investments in that respect. So why do we believe interconnections are so important for us? Not only for the integration of renewables, but also, of course, for market integration. But certainly also the security of supply is becoming more vital in the long term. And this is also what our security of supply monitor in the Netherlands confirms, that especially also the interconnections to the UK and Norway are of most value for the Dutch security of supply, as these systems are very complementary to ours. And this is very important as with more and more non-controllable renewable penetrating the system. We need more interconnections going forward to help us cope with moments in which there is low wind or solar output. Given the ambitious offshore and onshore renewable targets, we have to try to optimize the ways we develop new offshore infrastructure. And that's where MPI and also more meshing of networks come into play. And one of these ways is indeed MPI, and we see 4 clear advantages for that. Firstly, it can significantly reduce the cost for interconnector development compared to normal point-to-point interconnectors. Secondly, it reduces the environmental impact, and it can also reduce the development time. And it can also, thirdly, make more efficient use of expensive offshore infrastructure. that's deployed for connecting offshore wind, but these assets are only used for about half of its time and capacity. And last but not least, and we see that this plays a more and more important role, is we also need to make a more efficient use of the onshore grid capacity, as the onshore capacity between the offshore wind farm and the interconnector is being shared. So TenneT has been very proactive when it comes to exploring MPIs, and we are currently looking into concrete opportunities and projects between the Netherlands and the UK. But we are also looking more internationally in coordinated MPI opportunities in the North Sea Wind Power Hub program. In this program, we're even looking at energy islands and energy hubs up to 10 gigawatts, and also in connection with power conversion to hydrogen. But if we now look at the feasibility work so far we have done on the MPI, I believe there are two important lessons that can be drawn. The first one is we need to make sure that the technical coordination and standardization takes part. This is really key, but certainly also the suppliers and the industry can take care of that. Also, DC interoperability is of different suppliers will become key. But the second point, and this has also already been referred to by the other speakers, is that we need, on a political and regulatory level, we need an acceptable framework for all stakeholders involved that provide the appropriate investment incentives, and also is clear and predictable for investors given the huge investments that are required. So as TenneT, we believe that and are convinced that if we jointly and in collaboration tackle these kind of challenges, that we surely can already move forward before 2030 with MPIs and having these kind of pathfinder projects, as my colleagues mentioned it, clearly implemented in concrete projects. Thanks.
Okay, so we have 3 out of 3 on Pathfinder projects. I think we'll be taking that back, and I've got to open up some questions which I think anybody who feels non-politically constrained to answer, which is, so I mean, firstly, there's an issue with industry always wants predictable long-term regulation when things are massively uncertain and very difficult. So yeah, there is a different, I think risk and reward have to be balanced, but that doesn't mean no risk. And I think it's very clear that if we're going to move to what Martin said, which is a very different system, it's going to take longer. So it's not going to be stable in the short term. So back to this issue of how do we then kind of get the 2030 away while we're still building something that's fit for purpose for 2050? Does that require a political push, so going higher and making it a big thing, which has got its own dangers given the tensions around Brexit? Or do you think it can be done by a stronger push at the more technical, regulatory kind of officials and energy ministers level? Just be interested in your views, because what you're laying out there looks like a big lift. Who needs to do the lifting, and how do we decide who would like to take that more judgmental question? Nicola.
I'm happy to start there, and I think what I would say is there's a big change to be made in the commercial and regulatory framework to enable multi-purpose and hybrid interconnectors. But we don't necessarily know what all that is yet. What we do know is that there are some constraints today that need to be unlocked. And I wonder whether, if for the focus for 2030, what we should do is concentrate on a few Pathfinder projects with the derogations or exemptions or whatever else they need to allow them to go ahead. And as they're being developed, we'll start to learn what the best regulatory and commercial framework for the next tranche of hybrid interconnectors might look like. I think if we try to do a huge big change now, we'll run out of time before we can do anything for 2030.
No, maybe if I can continue, I agree to that. On the other hand, with regards to the need, and it was also mentioned before, the supply chain and constraints, there are some long lead time items that needs to be in play here, right? And if we don't have the regulatory in place, and we as a developer start developing and start occurring the usual cost and commitments and whatever, if then it doesn't happen, who is then carrying the can? Right, so it's there needs to be some kind of I don't know, whatever we would call it, funding or whatever, because otherwise no commercial entity would be allowed by the board to join a joint venture like that.
And it's not that we don't have first risk loss and other type mechanisms in other parts of this puzzle. Battery factories are getting huge amounts of money, electrolyzers are getting huge amounts of money. They seem to be a little more in front of politicians' minds as some of the other issues of the electrons to power those things, which is what offshore wind's going to do. So perhaps that's about case making. Yeah, Paul, interested in your view of this, and any of the government representatives. This is also slightly a policy issue about where risk lies and who bears the risk of the future.
I think in principle also the governments can certainly also give a push to technology standardization, interoperability, etc. Just maybe by funding or subsidizing some of these key projects. But I try to make it a little bit simple, but because we have shown by our calculations that we see that these multi-purpose interconnectors have higher socioeconomic value than simply building point-to-point interconnectors and also offshore connections for offshore wind. Simply the numbers show it, and then I always say if the numbers show that the business case is better, then we should be able to at least split the benefits in such a way to the parties in the chain. And but in all fairness, this framework is not yet there, and these frameworks are very difficult to connect in these cross-border projects. So, but in my view, this is something we should be able to connect, and that is the same thing then to a point that also Nicola referred to, also in relation to the 70% provision that is part of the clean energy package. Yeah? So we know that by combining offshore wind connections and point-to-point interconnectors, we are basically using the offshore infrastructure better. And we also know that that normally under normal conditions on offshore interconnectors, DC interconnectors, the SEP rule, the 70% provision is not an issue. If there is an issue, then it's being constrained by the onshore grid. It's not being constrained by so that we should be able to then to also explore if we even come up with a more efficient solution that's combining the thing in a multi-purpose interconnector, then we should be able to define a solution there. That's at least my belief. But and at the same time, we know it's not there, and it's a pragmatic issue that we need to deal with in the first project. So that's my view, that with the willingness we can solve it, but we should not continue on the path that we have an exemption on every project. And that's also what Mette said. It's a temporary thing, but we should be pragmatic in finding solutions and buying ourselves then the time also to define the long-term solutions.
This last round, I want the kind of quick answers, and anybody else, Martin and Morten, who are still on, if you want to join in, which is, do you know where to go to have the conversation you're just talking about? I'm just aware of, it's, kind of, or do you go between different ministries and try and string together that conversation? One of the things, I was involved in the offshore wind industrial policy in the UK when I was in government, and that unusually did create a space which was not, I think, in contravention of competition rules, but I'm not sure we checked that hard. But anyway, it allowed the industry to talk to government about where they were going, and that was one of the main things behind the cost reduction. It was quite unusual for the UK, perhaps more continental. But again, there was a space where people could talk at a level of granularity and honesty that somehow worked. I'm sure it took a lot more effort than it looks from the outside, as all these things do. But where do we have a place where we can actually resolve these pieces, or are we still talking about them in workshops, but not talking about them in a forum where we feel decision making could move forward fast? So where's the where?
Maybe just add a tiny bit to it, Nick.
Yeah, Martin.
Certainly from our perspective, the place really where we're discussing this particular type of thing is really in the working groups. That they're not occasional seminars, they're regular working groups in terms of the North Seas initiative, because that's where we have the regulators around the table, as well as the TSOs, and as well as the member states, the country members that are in it. I think kind of these are complex issues. And I would agree that kind of we can't stand still while we wait for the perfect solution, gold-plated solution to be ready by 2040 if we're lucky. We do have to move forward to try and deliver in the real world. And I think that is one of the challenges that's in that. You're trying to get agreement right across, not just kind of numerous member states and kind of the Commission. I mean, Norway sit as a full member of the initiative and kind of, you know, so it's not all EU members. So, you know, kind of that's why we'd be very anxious to try and kind of plug back in to get kind of broader representation at it. But I do think that's where you need to get it, because other than that, no one regulators tend to look inwards. They look into their own market and very rarely over their shoulder at what's happening next door. So I think left to their own devices, it would take a long time just to come out of that forum. It can't be done without them. They are the ones who set the market rules. But I think kind of it has to be kind of a broader discussion that it's only that is capable of delivering it.
Great. I think we're out of time now. There's some interesting ones in the Q&A, but I'm gonna attempt to sum up some of the things. It's been a really good conversation, and I feel we could we will probably have to do another one, I feel, just to kind of make sure we don't drop again. So what did I take from this? Time is the most scarce resource, not just an age-related issue, but a climate change-related issue. And I think this tension between the agreement that in order to get to 2050, we need radical reforms of commercial and regulatory arrangements, the balance of competition and cooperation, dealing with quite radical uncertainty in terms of some technologies, certainly of demand, certainly of things like the relationship with hydrogen, some of those areas. Those are just things we can't get rid of. So we have to live with those, and we have to find a way through that. That perhaps reducing the objections to onshore infrastructure and managing conflicts between marine users is a major political benefit that's sometimes underemphasized in the energy sector conversation, partly because they don't own a lot of those issues, and that could be one of the major ways of kind of unblocking some of the political will to do things more. That we've got, you know, we don't have the ideal forum for cooperation yet. We have some places. We are getting more cooperation between the UK and the EU, but also we need more cooperation within the EU. And I think the issue of making the case to the whole of the EU that this isn't just a kind of Northwest Europe issue, it has implications for the Mediterranean and the Baltic, but also implications for the benefits for the whole of Europe, would perhaps move some of the other regulatory and centralized decisions move forward a bit faster. And obviously it's also cooperation with Norway and Iceland. I think it's very interesting to see the role of Pathfinder projects as perhaps the way through. But Pathfinder projects, not just as we'll do exemptions and do Pathfinders, but Pathfinder projects explicitly put in the context of a parallel regulatory reform with a political level. And I was just thinking, you know, should there be an outcome agreed by the political level to build one or two of these energy islands or similar type, an outcome regulation like we had the outcome, we're going to try and get below 100 pounds a megawatt hour, which drove the industry government cooperation. So outcome-based goals, which are deliberately away from the regulatory system, but align us around a set of processes and ideas which drive forward into the kind of longer term change we need. Certainly in the second half of the 2020s, we need to have that regulatory system in place so that the long-term investments can be made and people know who's responsible for what risks and what builds. Because as Mette said, it's really important that you know, we make sure that the private sector can actually make the decisions we want them to make, and the public sector, if there's a public good here, picks up its fair share of the risk, and that's always contentious. That's again part of the social contract debate. And so I think I come back to kind of some questions that leaves me with one: do we need to build a stronger ecosystem of stakeholders and visibility around the current North Seas discussion, particularly thinking of other marine users, of onshore interests, and also of this kind of broader costs and benefits across Europe and to consumers? Because rather than just borrowing away for a long time, coming up with a perfect system that no one knows about, it just makes you think that need to think of kind of a broader, more multi-stakeholder forum and set of communications, which involve parliamentarians, for example. Where is there a North Seas Parliamentarian Forum? I'm sure there is. There's usually one of these things. Whenever you mention an institution, there's usually one of them. How can we get something that starts to bring in the more generalist interests, not just the specialist interests, so that they can also own the risks and benefits we're trying to deal with? And the last one we come back to is, do we need some type of political push to drive this forward, perhaps around those big Pathfinder projects, which would have short-term benefits, wouldn't look so structural in terms of crossing political red lines, but would actually get us moving and start to do the learning by doing we need to move forward a more general regulatory system. So I think there's some interesting ideas come out of this. We will be taking them away and testing them out, perhaps coming back and doing a future forum to push this forward, because I think everybody's aligned with the broad destination, but I don't think any of us have got a perfect roadmap to get there yet. But it's a super conversation. Thank you so much to all the speakers. Thank you for the attendees who have been sticking with us through this, and look forward to you coming back for another conversation to move this forward to the next stage.